This is a 1971 bus that my son Billy and I are partners in. It's a rust bucket. I'm going to do some body work on it in the future, but it's never going to be a show vehicle. I have a bent crank and it knocked out the rear main seal, so I'm going to have the case line bored, do a rebuild using a stroker crank and balanced rods. Now bear with me, you pros out there, because I try to make these videos explain so simply for people that have never had much experience in building VW engines. So I try not to overlook even the basics. I'm 77 now and near the end of my career, so I won't be doing this much longer. I'll have to leave it up to my son Billy to carry on with his VW work. This is the damaged rear main and is the reason for the line boring and the reason for this rebuild. There will be more about balancing in a video that I made that I inserted at the end of this video. Balancing this engine made such a difference I could actually feel it when the engine was done, how much smoother it is. When you weigh a piston, you want to weigh the piston pin, and I like using Teflon buttons. I weigh all this together, the piston, the Teflon button, and the piston pin. Weigh the piston several times and take an average. Of course, you want to find the lightest of the pistons and grind the other ones down to match the weight of the lightest. To remove material from a piston, one place you can remove it is on the underside of the head of the piston. One of the first things you'll want to do is set your distributor gear in clearance, which should be 4 or 5 thousandths. You can make shims to use with the steel shims, and you can make them from aluminum. Just be sure that you have steel shims on both sides of that aluminum shim. It'll work fine. But installing your distributor and checking your in clearance is the first thing you do before you start putting the engine together, installing the crank, gears, rods, etc. And make shallow little dimples in it with like a 1/2 inch drill, as seen here. You can also remove metal from the little end of the rod, as shown here, and from the sides and the end of the big end of the rod, as shown here. Now, as many of you know, the pistons are marked with an arrow that should point to the flywheel during assembly. The Teflon buttons I'm using, they all weighed identical, so here you see me weighing just the piston pin and the piston. And here I'm doing a rough check of a rod with a straight edge to make sure the rod's not bent. Measure on both sides. This is measuring the width of a rod, and this is a 1200 rod from a 1200 engine rebuild that I'll be doing a little later. It'll be a separate video. To use a 69mm crank in a 1200 engine, you have to cut the size of the big end of the rod, of the 1200 rod, to use the 1600 bearings. Check the clearance of your piston pin through the rod. It should just easily push through the rod with no side clearance. Just a snug push fit. This photo shows the proper assembly of the gears on the end of the crank. Now you can use a small propane torch to heat these gears, And if you're lucky, they'll slide right over the crank. Or you can use, like I did, a 20-ton press. Sometimes I use both methods. If heat doesn't let them slide on easily, I use the press. There is a cam timing mark on the cam gear here shown on the crank. Be sure that you have that crank gear turned in the proper position. And of course, if you want a really smooth engine, all your head CCs, your chamber CCs, should be the same, very close to the same. And that's what I'm doing here, CC and a head. Knowing the CCs of the head is important because you have to have that in order to figure out what you want for your final compression ratio, and usually what I shoot for is 9.3. You can buy these cheap plastic syringes online, and what I recommend using is cooking oil, because the cooking oil will not remove the writing, the figures on the syringe, like kerosene or something would. And this is a small syringe that I use to make small additions of cooking oil into the chamber. Painting your block and your sump flat black helps to dissipate heat. This is a Gene-Berg sump, and yes, they are expensive, but I've used other brands of sumps over the last 40 years, and many of them have been porous where they leaked oil, and this is made in the USA. This is a 74 crank from CB and balanced rods from CB, and I checked the balance on these rods, and yes, they were on the money. I mark my rods 1 through 4, and I also make that 1 through 4 mark on the top of the rod beam. The indentions for the rod bearing, little tab, the indentions go down. And after any machine work and before the start of the engine rebuild, you need to clean all passages with brushes here, and I believe these came from Harbor Freight. What you will be using here is plastic gauge 1 to 3/1000, and that's available almost anywhere, any auto parts store. I wish I had known about this drilling out of the oil relief hole in the case. It can be done from inside the case very easily. You'll see in this video a lot of plumbing I had to do to divert some of that oil pressure. I had over 100 pounds cold oil pressure, and that was way too much. I didn't want to strain that oil cooler, so I bled off part of it until the engine broke in. I don't know what the final oil pressure will be after this engine's broken in, but if it's still way too high, what I'll do is go to a smaller volume pump and remove the bypass plumbing. If you're going to be using a sump, you need to weld the supplied extension to the oil pickup before you clean the case and get ready for assembly. Even though I'm using a remote full flow spin-on oil filter, I still use the screen in the sump. When you have your block ready for assembly, and after welding the short piece of tubing on your oil pickup, if you're using a deep sump like I am, then you're ready for assembly. And what I wanted to show you here is that if you see the bearing, you can see that it's all the way down in the case. This is so critical because your bearings must fit into the case properly over the dowel pins. If you don't and tighten the case halves together, you may ruin a case. As shown here, the bearing is all the way down in the case as it should be. You can see here where the bearing is all the way down in the case. One of the first things to do is to install your distributor. and set it on number 1 cylinder. There is a small mark on the distributor where the cap goes, where the cap secures to the distributor. There's a mark that shows where number 1 should be, and that's important because the timing is different for number 3 cylinder, which tends to run hot, so it's slightly retarded. So that's very important you have the correct position for number 1. You then lower the crank assembly holding number 1 rod up, completely up, as you insert the crank into the case and into the distributor gear. That way it's in proper time. There were no clearance problems at all with this 74mm crank. And by looking at the rear main closely, you can see that it's even and that it's all the way down as it should be. I paint my jugs flat black for the same reason that I painted the sump, to dissipate heat. And here I'm using Plastigauge to check my clearance, and you need to take a plastic tool and scrape all this Plastigauge off your journals and off your bearings. Don't leave that plastic in your oil. Using brushes to clean out oil passages. I used denatured alcohol and plastic razor blades, which they're available online, to clean the gasket surfaces of the block. When Plastigauging, you need to use about half as much Plastigauge as shown here, and don't let it cover your oil passageway. And checking the cam bearing clearance is critical too if you want good oil pressure. I like to see 2 to 2.5 thousandths clearance on rods and mains, but 1.5 to 3 is acceptable. This is the plastic scraper I bought that uses plastic razor blades. I bought this online, and I use that to remove any Plastigauge from the bearing and from the crank or the cam. Be sure that the groove shown here at the end of the camshaft is clean for your camshaft plug that goes in the case. You need to use a good engine assembly lube when building your engine. Gene Berg recommends STP, which is good enough for me. If you are installing a new camshaft like Engel, most of those, like Engel, come with a cam assembly lube to protect your new lifters. Always use new lifters with a new cam, and if you have a used cam you're going to sell it with the matching lifters marked accordingly, 1 through 8. You need the cam gear clearance as close to 0 as possible. Gene Berg states that if you rotate the engine and the cam tries to lift out of the case, it's too tight. If it will turn the cam without lifting it out and you have no clearance with a dial indicator, that's perfect. Sometimes if you're unlucky and you have too much clearance, the only way to get the proper clearance is to have many used gears to pick from to find one that works. That can be a labor-intensive process. Don't forget that there are dowel pins that you must use to hold your bearings in place. All dowel pins go in one half of the case, but only one dowel pin goes for the center main and the other half of the case. If you do this wrong and start to bolt the case together, then you could ruin a case. So position of the dowel pins and installation of the dowel pins is critical. When you lower the case half over the case with the gears, the crank, the rods, and you're ready to close the case up, you have to use retaining clips to hold those lifters to keep them from falling out. Or you can use really heavy grease like wheel bearing grease. That will usually hold them in place. To clean the cam plug, I hold it with snap ring pliers and hold it against my wire wheel on my grinder, and I clean it off that way. Don't forget your cam plug. That's one of the biggest mistakes that a newcomer will make, is leaving the cam plug out or not getting their dowel pins in the correct position for the bearings. I personally use the Formagasket Permatex paste for the cam plug. When you have the crank assembly in the proper position in your case, then you can install the cam bearings in the cam gear and make sure that the cam gear is timed with the timing marks on the crank gear. Also notice the white O-ring seal the studs that hold the crankcase together. These seals are used on the later model cases. I have always used the Permatex Formagasket Aviation Sealant on the case halves. After cleaning the case halves, the sealing surface, then I apply a even coat to both sides of the case, let it sit up for a few minutes, and then bolt it together. If you're inexperienced at this, draw the two case halves together carefully and slowly and evenly until the Permatex squeezes out the case halves. Now, if you get into a bind at all, stop. It could be that you don't have your dowel pins in the right position. Don't force this case together. You will ruin the case. When the Permatex starts to squeeze out, you're home free. You know that there's nothing in a bind, and you can go ahead and torque your case to specifications. You can wipe off the excess with denatured alcohol. Cam case plug installed. This photo shows the piston above the jug, which is caused by the new stroker crank. This you don't want. Of course, you have to use spacers under these jugs, and you have to determine that when you determine other factors such as what compression ratio do you want. This is using a deck height tool and measuring deck height, but you don't absolutely have to have this tool. There's other ways of doing this. You can use a straight edge, but this is the most accurate way to do it. The bolt you see on the left stops the piston at exactly top dead center, and that's where you want to measure your deck height. Ideal deck height is like 40 to 60 thousandths. You have to know bore and stroke, you have to know your head cc's, and you have to know your deck height, and then you have to determine what cylinder spacers you may need at the base of the cylinder. This gets very complex, but there's a lot of information online how to do this, so do your research. The Gene Berg sump comes with special bolts and special washers. Use Loctite on these. Use Loctite on everything, as a matter of fact. The case is together now, and you can see the brass fitting on the front of the case. Of course, I drill that out for a remote oiler before I clean the case, before any installation of parts. Checking deck height is a lot easier if you don't have your piston rings on, but you can do it with the rings on. It just makes it a little bit more difficult. If you don't have a piston ring compressor, you can make one from a band of sheet metal, or you can use hose clamps, but it makes it a little bit more difficult. You need to clean the block where the cylinder jugs go in, and the reason for doing that is part of the sealer that seals the jug to the block will actually adhere to this too, helping ensure a good leak-free seal. I use lacquer thinner. I have always used Permatex Ultra Blue or Ultra Black. You can use the high temperature red, but I have never had a problem using the blue or the black. No leaks at all. I apply a good thick bead of sealer. Part of it will ooze into the block and help seal it there too. And of course, if you've got cylinder spacers, that needs to be applied to those as well. Using a cloth or a paper towel around the rod when you install the piston on the rod will ensure that you don't lose the piston pin clip down in the case should you drop it. I have the pistons installed in the jugs in the proper positions with just the hole for the wrist pin showing. I install the rearmost piston towards the flywheel first, and I put one of the piston ring clips in place in the piston before I install it on the rod. Then I push the piston pin into place, install the second retainer clip for the wrist pin, and then I do the next cylinder the same way, putting the piston ring retainer clip in place first, because it's so hard to get to it if you don't. It just makes things go a little bit easier. On this engine I use Teflon buttons, which makes it even easier than the clips. After you have your sealer on the jug, the piston installed, you push the jug down into the case, and then I made up some spacers out of PVC pipe to hold that jug down. Then I turn the crankshaft in place for the next jug and piston. After you've done this, then you need to check to make sure that both your cylinders are level. I don't show the PVC spacers in this photo holding the jugs down, but I would have those in place and then laying a straight edge across these cylinders. They should be perfectly flat, perfectly even. I found this photo of a 1200 jug and piston showing the PVC spacers I use to hold these cylinders in place, especially when you have sealer on the jugs and you're getting ready to install them into the case. Each one needs to be held down by the PVC spacers so you can turn the crank and get ready for the next cylinder and piston, jug and piston. Then I install the heads, torquing them evenly to specs. Then what I do to ensure that everything's okay before I put the rocker arms and the push rods and all in place is that I screw a pressure tester into the cylinder and I put pressure on it only with my mouth. Just blow into it, see if it holds pressure. If all checks out good, then you can go ahead and put your valve train on. You know that your valves are sealing, the heads are sealing. It's just a good simple check I do. Now I have the cylinder heads on and I'm ready to install the new push rod tubes and seals. These are made by Scat and I really like the way they look. These Scat push rod tubes are high quality, come with high quality silicone seals and the black O-rings you see here. Well, what was confusing about this is that they also contained a package of very small red Viton rubber O-rings. And being so small, I was confused. I didn't know where they went. So I called Scat, and they informed me that the red O-rings were Viton and to use those instead of the black, the Viton being an improvement. So they have to be stretched over this tube to get those on. And I was a little leery of that, but they seemed to work just fine. So I was so pleased with those, I ordered a set for my little 1200 VW. And these came without the red Viton O-rings. So I called SCAT again and told them that I did not receive the improved O-rings, and SCAT did what I really didn't expect them to do. They sent me the red Viton O-rings at no charge, and I promised them that when I made this video that I would compliment on what they did for me, because they did not have to do that. The springs on these pushrod tubes are really strong, and you can lose a finger or put an eye out. Make sure that you wear a face shield or safety protection, goggles. Protect yourself. Now, the way I did this, and I thought I had some photos of doing that, but I don't or can't find them. What I did, after I put my seals on and put the tubes together, springs and all, and had them ready, I inserted the bottom end of the tube into the case, and then I used a flat, sturdy, thick putty knife to push down on that tube assembly with the edge of the putty knife under the edge of the head, and then slide the tube into place. Now that worked really good, but you have to be careful. It's the only way I can see safely to do it. To remove it, you can push down on that tube from inside the head with a socket and pull it aside, let it catch on the edge of the head, and then pull it all the way out. Call SCAT at 310-370-5501. My son and I bought this engine adapter to adapt a regular VW engine into a bus because the VW engine isn't bored and tapped for the necessary bolts to hold it. And what a disaster this little adapter kit was. We had to modify everything. Now it's modified here because I'm using external oiler, but that's not what I'm griping about. This adapter did not work at all. I had to completely modify it. This adapter was made by a well-known, highly respected company, but things we've ordered for this company before have been good and they have been bad. And maybe you can see here how I completely had to rework that. I wanted to ensure that this mount would be as strong or stronger than the original mount would have been. I made this piece to cover over and be welded to give it full strength from where I had to cut out for the remote oil cooler fitting. I hope you can see and understand what all I had to do to this mount to make it work, but I feel confident that it's at least as strong as the original would have been. The pulley is so close with this high pressure oil pump that I had to grind part of the oil pump nuts off and modify the tin as you see here. The only thing that was correct about this mount kit was the 4 holes for the oil pump studs. That was the only thing that was correct and usable about this kit. I wanted to cut this case for a sand seal, so I ordered this tool from Gene Berg, and I think it was $190 some. And this tool works well, it cuts well, but there are a lot of drawbacks to it. It's a little finicky about how to adjust it. It doesn't always work out. It will not cut correctly as ordered. And that's one of my main complaints about it. That carbide cutter on this tool has to be shimmed in order to get the correct cut. And it's trial and error. And if you cut it too large, you're in real trouble. So you have to go slowly using this tool, but it does work. The other complaint I have about it is that the O-rings that come with it to keep the chips out of the case, out of the sump, if you pull that out and try to reinsert it, the sharp edge you have cut will destroy the O-ring. And I don't like the wrench that comes with this to turn it with either. So I have some complaints about this tool, but it's the only one out there. And it will work, but you have to use extreme patience using it and care. There is more information at the end of this video about this tool. It's also available to rent, and I've forgotten exactly who has it for rent, but you can rent it for $50, but you have to pay a big deposit in order to rent it. And there's a waiting list, usually. The pulley has to be machined. You need to use the later model pulley. I cut my 1200 case for sand seal, but it has a shorter pulley on it. So I went to the larger pulley. You have to have a machinist turn that pulley down to, I believe it, 770 thousandths. When I say bigger, I should have said longer. The hub length of that, where the seal rides, is longer on the late model VW pulley than the early, like 1200. I had trouble with my fuel pump. It wouldn't pump after sitting for a while, and I must have not gotten all the fuel out of it, and it gummed up. After cleaning it with WD-40, letting it soak, it started working again. But in the meantime, before I did that, I took a fuel pump I had that had a broken arm in it, and I took the arm out of another pump and fixed that. So you can do that. I seal the holes in that front tin with a piece of aluminum duct tape. The original location of this oil filter didn't work out. It was too low. I had to relocate it. Now you can see the relocation of the oil filter. And also, if you'll notice that engine support, engine mount, you'll notice that I had to move the cross member to the rear about 3/4 of an inch because of the width of the new high volume oil pump. Okay, so I made a big mistake, and let me tell you what that was. I took the advice of a salesperson at one of the most reputable, oldest VW firms in the USA. I told him about having the block line board and would he select the oil pump for me. He recommended a high volume, high pressure pump, and I went with that, trusting his opinion. He said because the case had been line bored that I never would have good oil pressure, and that I needed this high volume oil pump, and nothing could be further than the truth. If you get your engine bearing tolerances the way I've shown in this video, You will have excellent oil pressure regardless of the case being line bored. So with oil pressure about 105 pounds cold, that's way too much. I wanted 40 to 50. So I bled off part of this oil pressure back into the crankcase. If you drill out the oil pressure relief hole back into the crankcase like I mentioned earlier, and as I did on my 1200 engine, then you'll have oil pressure probably, even with a high pressure pump, 40 to 50 pounds. I never should have listened to that young man, but you know, I thought he knew what he was talking about. He didn't. It all depends by the end of the summer what the oil pressure is, whether I will go back to a stock pump or this pump will work out. By that I mean, can I shut off this oil return line? Will the oil pressure still be way too high? Now the part I hate most, setting the crankshaft in play, and it should be about 4 thousandths. After you have determined the in play, then you replace the seal, the oil seal. It comes last. As you probably know, the flywheel will only go on one way, one position. Here's the tool that I use, and you can make one of these, but I bought this one. Here's the tool I use to set the crankshaft in play, to measure it, that is. With the crankshaft all the way to the rear, to the flywheel side. Then you adjust the bolt you see here to where it barely touches the flywheel. Then you push the flywheel in all the way, and with a feeler gauge you determine the shims you need. Then with a micrometer you pick out the shim pack you need. There'll be more than one. You pick out the shims you need to give you that 4 thousandths clearance. Put the flywheel on and measure the clearance again. Make sure you have it right. Once you do, you can install the seal. You have to be very careful doing this or you can ruin your rear main bearing and possibly the case if you don't measure correctly and the flywheel is too tight against the bearing. Now I have a seal installer tool that you see here, but it really doesn't work as advertised. I coat the outside edge with Permatex. Then I start the seal in the case and I run this seal tool up against it. This seal tool will not draw the seal in straight. You'll ruin a seal if you try. What I do is snug it up to the seal, tap around it with a hammer to make sure it's going in even, tighten it a little bit more, tap it a little bit more with a hammer until I get the seal completely in, as shown here. And of course you always use the red seal. There may be some black seals still out there. Don't use them. You have to check your crankshaft in-play clearance again just to be on the safe side. And if it comes up that it's wrong and you have to change it and remove the seal, this is the tool I use. The right end of this bearing cap puller will remove the seal without damage if you're very careful and just pry it out a little bit as you go around the seal. You can save and reuse the seal. In this photo you can see the little cutoff valve I use to regulate the oil pressure, how much bleeds back into the sump. And again you see the location of the rear motor support now, how it's been moved to the rear about 3/4 or an inch. I had some exhaust wrap left from my son's race Blazer, so I used that to keep the heat in the exhaust and not under the engine tin. Every little bit helps. There is wire wrapped around that to hold that in place. I have the engine hooked up to my starter. I want to run an oil pressure check before I go any further. With the spark plugs removed, of course, and an oil pressure gauge hooked up. This is the way I'll support this engine while I run it on this little makeshift test stand. Okay, here's what we have. I've got my starter hooked up to the engine, got my oil pressure gauge set, remote starter switch, and the power I'm using is kind of feeble, but it's my battery charger. So we're going to run an oil pressure test on this, and this is live. If there's any mistakes, I'll tell you. Okay, let's see how much oil pressure this engine has. $65. Good. I like using welded flanges when I can on VW exhaust. It just works out so much better. This remote oil filter from Gene Berg came with all the hoses necessary and also came with a high-performance Fram filter. Higher performance than I really need for the street. And I had to move this oil filter because it was mounted too low. Couldn't tell what I needed till I got the engine in. Once I was happy with oil pressure, then I started putting the rest of the engine together while it was on my little test stand. And this is the first filter location that I ended up changing. I knew that this engine, now being a 1968cc engine, that I would need a breather box. All the breather boxes I have seen are overpriced and overrated, and I'll show you how to make one that works just great. This is the way I supported the rear of the engine. There's 2 lag screws through the bottom of that transaxle. From studies done about VW cooling, it's always best to leave the flaps in. You don't have to use a thermostat. In fact, I don't here in North Carolina. It isn't that cold. And if the thermostat goes bad, there's not much of a way you're going to know it until the engine's ruined. There is a high failure rate for these thermostats. Should you decide to use a thermostat, the thermostat rod goes through the largest hole you see here. This breather I made is made from 2-inch PVC pipe with fittings on both ends that it will accept a PVC pipe plug. And in the end of that plug, I have it drilled out to accept a screw fit, a tight fit. They're just the right size to where I screw that fitting into those pipe plugs. The black plastic fitting you see here is a return line to the oil filter stand. The piece of PVC pipe I use on the inside of this 1.5-inch breather, the ends will come right up and touch these 2 end screw caps you see at the bottom of this photo, and that will seal it. Now here's the inside pipe, and it's drilled, as you see, for the oil to separate. The oil will separate in this, come in both sides, vented in both sides, then separate. This screen, several layers of screen held in place by some O-rings, will help filter out and catch that oil so it can return to the oil filler stand. You can use Teflon tape as a sealer for these end caps, or you can use the Teflon paste. I made this breather for less than $15 and it works great. Now you see how this breather box I made is installed. And like I say, it works great. I've also modified the valve covers with 290-degree fittings for the hoses. I hate for you to see this engine this dirty, but I've just been so busy I haven't had time to keep up all I have to keep up. This engine has 9.3 compression ratio, Engel cam and lifters, cam kit, the springs, heads ported and polished, CB performance crank and CB rods balanced, new 8-valve flywheel and a Kennedy clutch, Weber progressive and a 009 distributor, electric fuel pump. SEMA 92 pistons and jugs, Teflon buttons, and a Bosch blue coil, a Berg 1.5 quart sump, remote oil filter spin on, high volume oil pump, Berg, steel push rods. Now, as I always say in my videos, you may disagree with a lot of things that I've said here, but this has worked fine for me for, oh gosh, 45 years of doing this. I have a fused ignition switch wire and switch with a light that lets me know when the ignition switch is on this little engine test stand. Actually, I have a much better homemade engine test stand than what you see here, but it won't work with a deep sump. Here's some technical information that's nice to have, but you would probably have to view this on a large screen TV. All these bearing size charts and case information can be found at Dune Buggy Warehouse. This sand seal tool rental can be found at aircooled.net. The only bad thing about using one of these slip-in sand seals is that your hole in the case may not be in a perfect alignment with the crankshaft, if you follow me. For more VW videos, including engine rebuild videos, visit Bill Tate on YouTube. Some of these are in much more detail. Of course, the first thing you'll need if you're going to balance pistons and connecting rods is a good scale. I like this one. It works real well. There will be some duplication in this video, but you'll need other small parts. You need small washers that don't interfere with the outside diameter of the bearing, and you also need to make some small spacers. Now this video is just meant to give you ideas. You can do this any way you choose, and you can use whatever bearings you have on hand. In this photo you can see that I've used a stud. Now you don't have to use a stud, you could use a bolt, but it needs to be threaded the entire length so you can jam it with a nut as you see here. The washers and bearings must not interfere with each other and must turn easily, freely. The reason for using bearings, and it is essential to use bearings, is that when you set the rod down on these bearings, it allows the rod to move a little bit, the fixture to move a little bit, and it won't affect the measurement, the weight measurement of the rod. This photo explains what I mean by side movement. When you set the tip of that rod down, as shown here, the small end, the wrist pin end, you want it to sit directly on that and not try to move sideways, either way. It depends on the rod as to where you remove metal. This is a VW rod. This is where I would remove the metal. Mark your rods before you start weighing or removing metal. This scale has a tare reading which allows and takes into consideration the weight of the adapter on it and goes back to 0. As far as the adapter for the large end, the crank end, you can make your own adapter. You could use something like a skate wheel with bearings in it, but it needs to be fairly large, and the reason for that being you want to keep the rod level without having to constantly adjust and turn the adjusting screws. For an accurate measurement, the rod should be close to level. The top arrow shows the adjusting screws that go through the lower bracket that has elongated holes so that the bracket can be pulled away from the top bracket. And the second arrow, the middle arrow, shows a 1/4-inch stud that I used to support the adapter. And the bottom arrow shows the bearings that I used. You can use any configuration of bearings that you choose. I used 3 in this case. And this shows the adapter, which is roughly 3/4 of an inch wide, and if you need to shim it up a little bit with something like masking tape to make these fit together, that's fine, but use your own configuration. And this is the entire weight setup, and says more about the elongation of the holes in the brackets and how they're allowed to swing. And this is weighing the crankshaft end. This shows where I have removed metal from the wrist pin end of the connecting rod. There will probably be more parts to this video. I'm going to do some work at my shop as far as removing the metal and doing the actual balancing. And also I'll be doing other things like CCing cylinder heads for volume, balancing the pistons, piston rings, Teflon buttons, and wrist pins. So check for more video parts at a later date. I hope this video helps you. At 76, I'm still working on cars. I wanted to explain to you the use of this little device I made to weigh pistons and connecting rods. The critical thing in doing this is that when you mount the rod to this stand, it tends to shift a little bit one way or the other, sideways. You need to make sure that you move your scale to where the rod doesn't shift at all for an accurate measurement. Now this little adapter here I made out of a piece of wood I cut with a hole saw, and then I cut part of a PVC 90-degree elbow to make a outer rim for that little wooden wheel. This of course is set up for the big end. The little end would go here. Now these bearings are available from Amazon. They are, and let me read that to you, 1/4 inch by 5/8, come in a pack of 10. They were $11.99, and this is 2019 prices. So what you need to do is weigh this adapter I made, and after weighing the adapter, they have a setting called the tare setting, which will set the scale back to 0 after this has been added, so it disregards the weight of this adapter. I believe I ordered this postal scale from Amazon. The name of it is Smart Weigh. The wood shown here is a piece 7 by 10 inches, 3/4 inch plywood. The upright piece of wood is 4 inches by 8 inches, screwed to the side of the platform with 2 drywall screws. These corner brackets are available at any hardware store. These came from Walmart. They're 3-inch corner brackets. These little spacers that I made are made from a piece of supply tubing for a toilet. And there's little washers that I use to keep that tubing from hitting the side of the bearing. And this stud is a stud I had from something I did with a VW engine. I've forgotten what it was. 1/4 inch stud though, roughly. The measurement of this piece of wood in order to fit on the scale is 3 inches by 3 inches. The purpose of the bearings is that when you put the rod on this little device, it tends to pull the fixture that holds the rod on top of the scale. It tends to shift it back and forth, and that disturbs the reading, upsets the reading of the scale. So it's best to use roller bearings or ball bearings so that that doesn't happen. And still you need, like I said before, you need to take extreme care to make sure this is not pulled one way or the other sideways when you mount that rod for an accurate measurement. It's also very important that this little adapter be allowed to swing and self-center. And you see here it's also adjustable if need be. You can see here where there's a space between the 2 corner brackets. In order to do that, where it'll swing free, you need to elongate these 2 holes with a 1/4 inch drill. And I've covered the part of that elongated hole with a piece of tape to keep it centered where I want it. But that's what you need right there. Works great. I want to give credit to Cars, Bikes, and Coffee YouTube page and their YouTube video on how to balance pistons and rods. You need to see that in addition to my video. Now, I took my ideas here and improved upon them slightly from their ideas. But like them, the first one I made did not work so well. This is an improved version, the final version. This should work just perfectly. You weigh your rods and pistons and you take the lightest one of the group and you grind the others down to match that lightest piston or rod. You can do that using a bench grinder or you can do it with a belt sander. But you have to do it slowly and carefully because you don't want to take too much and go beyond what you need. I have a piece of saran wrap on that scale to protect it from the oil. I want to mention that a metal BB weighs 0.4 of a gram, so that gives you an idea of how much metal to remove. $601.8 grams. But I want to weigh it again. $601.9 grams. $601.8 grams is what I'm going to go with. And that is for number 4 rod. $597.1. Let's do it 2 more times to be sure. $584.5. $607.3. See, it's critical to measure this several times, weigh it several times. You have to get that fairly well centered on that scale to get an accurate reading. 607.2 for that. This is number 3 rod. Again, I'm going to do it one more time here. $607 for that. For that number 3 rod. Okay, now number 1 rod. $593.6. $593.5. $586. Let's try this another time. $592.1. I'm not happy with that yet. You got to place this rod just perfectly to get the same readings. $593.7. $593.5, and I'm going to accept that as the final reading on it. And again, that's number 1 rod. These are stock VW rods here. They have not been balanced at all. Now, on each rod, I take my die grinder or Dremel tool and mark 1, 2, 3, 4 on VW rods. And this is number 2 rod. 596.8. 596.6. 596.9. I'm going to accept that as the final reading too on number 2 rod. Now these rods are from CB Performance. These are new rods from their new casting, and supposedly they have already been balanced, clearanced, and this is number 1 rod. .6 first reading. 538.7. 538.7. So I'll accept that as the final reading for this one too. And that is number 1 rod again. Number 2 rod. Now when I say clearanced, this VW engine I'm building now is going to have a stroker crankshaft in it. And the rods will have to be clearanced to clear the case. Okay, number 2 rod, 539.6. 539.6. 539.5 for number 2 rod. $539.2, 539.3. You have to be careful with the scale. I don't want to drop a rod on it and break it. Delicate piece of equipment. 538.8. 539.2, and I'll accept that for number 3 rod. Number 4 rod, 539.6, 539.6, and 539.4. 5, there it changed to 5. I'll accept that as the final reading for number 4 rod. Since I have all of my equipment at my shop, my grinders, I won't be balancing those rods here at my home today. I'll just be measuring them. And when you weigh your pistons for the lightest piston, you need to weigh the piston rings, and the wrist pin for the lightest one. Okay, everything's go to put this engine in. I was able to bleed off and adjust that oil pressure down to a reasonable level, 40 to 55, 60 pounds. This engine turned out great, and it's got great low end power, a lot of torque in this engine. And it's real smooth thanks to the careful care in balancing. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it was of help to you. I won't be doing this much longer, but I've got a couple more projects, some restorations to do before I completely quit. So, see you in the next video.